Tonight's story, which you are about to hear, began after a revenge that, in the words of the same subject, ended with a passion for the taste of human flesh. That feeling of domination and control that is obtained after taking another's life is what motivated this man. Joseph Roy Metheny, a morbidly obese subject with a penetrating gaze and thick features with an intimidating smile. With a height of 185 m and a weight of more than 150 kilograms, he mentioned in a statement, "The next time you're down the road and come across a burger stand you've never seen, think hard about this story, as you never know who you might be eating." The following criminal story has as its protagonist Joseph Roy Metheny, who was born on March 2, 1955 in Baltimore, United States, in a family of 6 children, where most of the time they were neglected by their parents, since his parent had an alcoholism problem, and the money was spent on the drink, so his mother had to work hard to support them. At the age of 6, his father died in a car accident, and the children passed into the care of his mother, who assumed the reins of the family, neglecting them even more, since in order to be able to meet the entire monetary burden, he had to work up to double shifts to obtain greater income. As a waitress and food truck driver, he and his siblings were sent to live with other families in the foster care system, which allows children in situations of danger, abuse, and abandonment to live in a safe place temporarily, until it is determined that they can be returned to their biological parents or, where appropriate, the family in charge of their care wishes to adopt them. Joseph took refuge in the food, and he began to eat out of control, which caused him a serious obesity problem that was compensated for as he grew at the age of 18. He stated that he joined the U.S. Army in 1973 and served in Germany. During his service, Joseph became addicted to drugs, noticeably changing his behavior, this being the beginning of many problems that would be to come. His mother began to notice the deterioration of her son, who was moving further and further away from the family. Joseph was known to his friends as tiny or small, since he averaged 1.85 m and had a large build. His addiction gradually led him to follow his father's example, and he began to frequent bars and canteens, living with homeless people on the street, and the ones who made improvised camps south of Baltimore. It is there where he meets a woman whose name is unknown, with whom he would have his first child. After learning that he was going to be a father, he got a job in a company where everything was going well, since he was considered an intelligent, well-spoken, and very educated person. What few knew was that he had an addiction problem. It all started on the night of July 1994. Joseph was at work since he worked driving a forklift at the Palex company, which was dedicated to the sale and manufacture of pallets. That night he worked late and stayed overtime. At the end of his day, he went home as he usually did. Opening the door, he turned on the light and realized that the house was empty. Neither his 6-year-old son nor his wife were found. She had taken everything and abandoned him when she saw it. He in his home was angry not so much because of the loss of his wife, who was addicted to drugs and with whom he frequently fought, but because he loved his son. In fact, he categorized his wife as trash who consumed substances of all kinds. After a few days, he started looking all over for them without success at it. It wasn't until 6 months later that some people told her that they had seen her on the other side of town, with a subject who forced her to offer intimate services in exchange for drugs, regardless of whether the child was present. Until after a few days, his ex-wife and her partner were arrested for consumption and possession of illicit substances and took the minor away for neglect and child abuse. Joseph could do nothing to get his son returned to him, so he became filled with hatred towards his wife and her partner. He felt at one point that they should pay for what they had done to him, snatch his son from him. So he began the search for both of them, since he learned that they had been set free. The only punishment was that they took the minor away from them. So he discovered that they were living under a bridge with drug addicts and homeless people. So one day, he made the decision to go look for them. But unfortunately for him, he couldn't find them. However, he found two people lying on an old and dirty mattress. So when he saw them, he remembered the reason why his son had been taken from him and exploded in anger against them, depriving them of their lives with an axe. After the incident, he hid them in some bushes and continued searching the areas near the place. That same night, the search continued on nearby bridges. It is then that he notices that near where he had committed the murders there were two women under the bridge. So he headed towards them and tried to get information from them about his wife's whereabouts. One of them walked a few yards. That's where he questioned her to get the information. But due to the influence of the substances, she didn't reason and acted as if she didn't know anything. When he didn't get what he wanted, he started beating her and then abusing her and finally ending her life. When he was done with her, he dragged her to some bushes and left her there. Then he went to the next woman and did the same thing. But he claimed he didn't know who he was talking to. So he murdered her. But just as he was about to throw her into the bushes with the other girl, he noticed an old man fishing by the river watching him. So he took a steel pipe from among the trash and ran towards it. When that old man tried to react, he received a series of blows that ended his life once he came to his senses and realized what he had done. He dragged the bodies of the victims to one side of the Patapsco River, in the city of Baltimore in the state of Maryland, United States, and tried to hide them with stones. Then he washed himself in the river, and he tried to clean the place as much as he could so as not to leave any clues that night. He mentioned that he committed the 5 murders in the approximately 7 hours that the search for his wife lasted. One night in 1994, he lured Katie and Magaziner, 39 years old, with a criminal record to the factory. They were consuming illicit substances. And after she refused to have intimacy with him, he took her by the neck and deprived her of breath until he murdered her. After the fact, he dug a shallow grave in a small forest behind the factory, where he went unnoticed and where he remained for 6 months until Joseph ripped off his head and threw it in the trash. The body stayed there for a few years. On August 2nd, 1995, the bodies of the vagrants were discovered, who were identified as Randall Brewer and Randy Baker. Weeks later, Metheny was accused of both murders. Since that night, some people saw an overweight subject hanging around the bridges. So when investigating, they found the whereabouts of the probable suspect. Joseph Metheny was denied bail and had to remain in the Baltimore City Jail for 18 months awaiting trial. However, there was no indication that he was incriminated. After the trial lasted 1 week, he was released for lack of evidence, since it could be established that the perpetrator of the incident had been another subject who was also a vagrant. Upon his release, he went to his previous job to ask his boss to give him back his job at the wood pallet company in Baltimore. His boss agreed, since he considered him a good worker. But not only that, he also granted Joseph's request to stay in a small trailer that he had inside the property with the promise that he would watch the place. Since having been in prison, he had nowhere to stay. So he gave him the keys of the whole place, trusting in his goodwill. But what I didn't know was that I knew I had other plans in mind. Since the company was on a cul-de-sac isolated from the highway, a perfect place to commit their fantasies. In November 1996, he lured Kimberly Line Spicer, whom he stabbed to death after she resisted having intimacy with him. He buried his body inside the factory. It's right now, where he mentioned that he cut up his victim's flesh and put it in some tuppers and then put them in the fridge. During that week, he set up a small burger stand where he claimed he mixed pork and beef with human meat and that no one could notice the difference in flavor. He He even mentioned that many people told him that the burgers were the best they had ever tried. He added that everything was going well, until he ran out of special meat. On December 8, 1996, he brought in his new victim named Rita Kemper. He mentioned that they shared drugs for quite a while inside the trailer until he tried to rip her clothes off. She refused to have intimacy with him, and in desperation, she began to scream. But there was no one who could help her. So he accidentally ran out of the trailer. Joseph followed her and dragged her. On his return, he told her that he was going to murder her. So as best he could, he managed to escape. Again, he ran to a wire fence which had barbs at the top. But that was no impediment to his jumping. He ran to the road, and a guy in a van pulled up. When he saw her, he took her to a nearby gas station where the police were called. Joseph picked up his clothes since he knew they would soon come for him. But when he got out of trailer, one of the officers, he was already there. He told him to get down on the ground, so they took him into custody and began to interrogate him. Predictably, he denied all charges, the ones he'd been arrested for. One of them is that the girl mentioned that he told her that she was going to end up like the other girls who were buried in the forest. He immediately denied such words, adding that he did everything with her consent. So they let him go, seeing that perhaps the police could go to the scene to verify that everything was fine. Joseph asked a friend to help him dig up Kimberly's body, which was still inside the factory. It was then that on December 15, 1996, his friend reported him to the authorities, arguing that Joseph asked him to help him move the body of a woman that he had buried to the side of the trailer. On their way to the scene, the police arrested him again and even arrested the owner of the business for alleged complicity. Then they asked Joseph to tell them where he had buried Kimberly. He gave them the exact location, and while digging, they came across the body of a woman. So that same day, once the interrogations began, he confessed to other crimes. Among them was the previous victim, cat eye and magazine. So he led the police to the place where he had buried her. So they found a shallow grave where he had buried her remains. Much of the skull was missing, but the victim could be identified through his dental records. Evidently, they belonged to Cat Eye, but days later he claimed to be a serial killer and that he had committed 13 murders. According to him, he threw the bodies into the Patapsco River and that they had never been found. He even claimed that many of his victims had been cut into parts and that he had kept the meat for later eating. Later, he came up with the idea of setting up a food stall to sell human meat combined with animal meat. At first, the statements were shocking. But as the days passed, the veracity of his words began to be questioned. Since every day he was interrogated in a small room. Since the investigators wanted to clarify and close many unsolved cases. Trying to find out what he had done. He was taken out of jail every day. He was being driven from place to tell investigators where he had dumped the bodies. So a month passed and they could never find any victims, of whom I know he boasted to have murdered. At this point, the detectives did not know if I was telling them the truth or just delusional. Since there was a great stability in what I was saying, it sounded too fantastical to be true. The main problem with investigating Joseph Metheny is that he was also a liar and had the ability to create stories while telling everything in 1997. He was tried in the case of Rita Kemper, the last victim who managed to escape, and was sentenced to 50 years in prison for attempting to kidnap and abuse her. In 1998, he pleaded guilty to murdering Katie Magazine. On July 14, 2000, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. No one understood if I lied for pleasure, or if his mind was so unbalanced that he confessed to past crimes. Evidence of the crimes he allegedly committed was never found. Nor was it verified whether he actually opened his meat shop to sell the bodies of his victims. The only murders that could be verified were two. His mental imbalance was noticeable, which led him to create false confessions. Finally, he mentioned the words, "I'm sorry." They'll never come out of my mouth, because that would be a lie. I'm more than willing to give my life for what I have done, so that God can judge me and send me to hell for eternity. Just enjoy it. On Saturday, August 5th, 2017, he was mysteriously found dead in his cell around 3 p.m. at Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, of unknown causes at the age of 62. This case is a clear example that not everything murderers confess is true, since many tend to attribute crimes that they did not commit for the sole purpose of being important and recognized.